How's everybody doing today? Hopefully well. Today we're going to look at this 2020 Ram 3500. Came in a shop for EGR codes, and I'm going to just kind of run through how we diagnosed it. So here we go. This is what the EGR valve looks like, and this is the old design. So 2018 to 2007 design right there. So I scanned it for codes, and we had P046C EGR flow insufficient detected on A, and then we have some misfire codes. Didn't ever fill a misfire, so that's kind of interesting. We also have P046C EGR sensor A circuit performance in the blind spot codes and the turn signal codes. That's all because it's a flatbed, and so that's why those codes are there active. So I look at the environmental data, they call it, on the scan tool on the YTech. I'm not sure if this is going to be visible on aftermarket scan tools like Snap-on, Autel, Launch, etc. But we have the EGR sensor A circuit performance code. Basically, what this code is saying is, hey, our EGR valve is commanded on and it's not moving. I'm looking at the mileage that it's set at 95,254. Now I'm looking at this code here. So the 2007 to even 2022 current vehicles, a lot of times when you have an EGR trouble code, say a bad EGR valve, you're also going to have NOx exceedance deactivation EGR code. They just kind of go hand in hand. So just be aware of that. And it said the same mileage if you look, so you know that they're related to one another by the mileage they set. Here we have a EGR code. Now what I'm looking at mainly is I want to look for the EGR position that it was in when the code's set. And just from experience, I know that this is going to be maybe wanting about more than 10% at idle. And when it set the code, it was at 0%. So that's not okay. And that's why the code's set. Now right here, this is the EGR valve position actual on the top. And the bottom is the EGR valve position commanded by the PCM. So if you look, it actually commanded, let's see, about 60 to 80% right after startup, about 5 to 10 seconds after startup. And it's kind of quick after startup, but these EGR valves are not like gasoline engines. They will run at idle. So if you have an EGR valve that's coming on at idle on a diesel, that's normal. So keep that in mind. All right, so this is a circuit here. This is what I'm going to be looking at. Power and ground at the EGR valve motor. Basically, it has electric motor, 2-wire motor to move the throttle, the valve itself. So there's actually a door that moves and controls the exhaust gas flow back into the engine. It's called the EGR valve. So we have power and ground, pretty simple, the red and gray there, and then we have a sensor, just a 3-wire sensor. Just think of it as a throttle position sensor that you've been looking at for years. 5-volt reference, ground, and signal. And that's basically how it works there. So here I am testing it. Now I tested it, the sensor return first, just because, no real reason. And I had 11 ohms. Now, I don't have both batteries disconnected. kind of hard to get those negative battery terminals off. And I know from experience that 11 ohms is probably just fine. And you're going to confirm that by back probing a closed circuit. In other words, connect the connector on the EGR valve. If you have 0 volts on the return, you should be okay theoretically. Yeah, you could have, something really odd going on maybe in the computer circuit board, but I mean, chances are if you have 0 volts or close to it on the sensor return, we'll just call it the ground because that's what it is, then you're fine. And again, I have 11 ohms probably because the batteries aren't disconnected. Usually you want to be 2 ohms or under on a ground, but we'll get into why that. I know that's okay, the 11 ohms, in a second here. So I'm going to check in a second here, right there. I'm checking the EGR cooler bypass. It shares the same ground, and it was also 11 ohms. So that tells me that, that 11 ohms is probably just normal resistance amount. And what I'm trying to avoid here is I don't want to take the PCM connectors off the Cummins engine because they're really fun to get off, and they can break the connector ends, and then you might need a whole harness. And if you think about maybe replacing those connectors with a wrecking yard one, I can tell you from lots of electrical experience, they're very, very difficult to switch out connector ends on a PCM with the Cummins from 2010 and up, I would say. So the connectors, they have such small terminals, it's almost microscopic, and there's a lot of them because it's a diesel. So now I'm testing the EGR valve sensor 5 volt reference. Disconnected, key is on, and I should have 5 volts. And I have 0 volts. And I'm sorry, that right there should have been 5 volts. And it wasn't. I think the ignition timed out, and that can happen on newer vehicles with keyless go. You hit a button to turn the ignition on, and it might time out after 10 minutes. So that's what happened on that. But it should have been 5 volts disconnected on the 5 volt reference wire. Okay, so right now I'm confirming, and I'm looking at this signal wire. My EGR is connected, and the signal wire is showing 0.7 volts, and that is indicating that it's at 0%. And the scan tool just confirms that. Now, if I wanted to, I can go in there and I could find a way to move the valve and see if the position changes on the scan tool. And if you don't have a scan tool, you can use a DVOM. Obviously, you need to be plugged into the EGR valve when you're checking the signal for change, because it's a variable resistor that changes with the shaft movement in the EGR. So I would imagine that it would go from 0.7 closed to 4.5 fully open. That's generally how that works. And then as far as, other things that you could try and do, you could try and check the resistance of the EGR valve. In this case, I had a shorted EGR valve. It was, half an ohm, pretty much a dead short, but not exactly. And it stopped working. Maybe it got bound up with carbon. Some of these EGR valves on 2019 up are having issues where the door spins and weird stuff happens when we get EGR valve codes. So we had to replace the EGR valve, and it still had some EGR codes, and so that's what we're looking at right now after the new EGR valve from Mopar. So now I'm testing the motor, plugged in, back probed on the red and gray wires at the same time, and I had no voltage. And so that right there, if you go back, I had 13 ohms or 13,000 ohms. Let me go back here, right there. So 13,000 ohms is what, you know, the resistance probably is of the transistor. You always want to kind of take notes of resistance while back probing, just because it can save you a lot of time when a harness connector like this CUMMINS PCM harness connector is so dang hard to get off, and even, you know, trying to load test that circuit. Those terminal slots are so small that they don't even make a factory tool to do like a pin drag test on them. They don't make anything that's realistic to try and do a continuity test. So anything you can do to save yourself some heartache and not take the connector end off. So in this case, we have 13,000 ohms on both wires. In this case, I had, you know, switched it, check one at a time. So my black lead's on ground right here. My red lead's on one of the wires, one of the two control wires, and they reverse polarity. So that EGR valve motor is going to, in the PCM, switch polarity like a window switch circuit. And that's how we get movement to different, you know, positions that we want of the EGR valve for exhaust flow. But so right there, that tells me I have continuity all the way to the circuit board, all the way to the transistor. Now, there's no way for me to check, you know, further than that without taking the computer off and testing the circuit board, but we don't dive in that deep. That's just not what we do. Even dealerships don't do that type of stuff. They send that out if there's not one available to have it rebuilt. But I'm guessing that the transistor on the trigger side just damaged or something, or maybe the microcontrol unit on the circuit board. But anyways, so in this case, I checked both. They were both 13,000 ohms. So we should be good all the way to the computer and saving us a few hours of just doing continuity test. So just a quick recap, 13,000 ohms, and it's pretty much the same if you disconnect the EGR valve and turn the ignition off and check the motor control wires. Those two wires probably going to be about 8 to 14,000 ohms, maybe higher. Sometimes it can go up to 30,000 ohms, but what you're looking for is, you know, similar readings when compared to a like vehicle. So take notes. And then 5 volt, you should have 5 volts coming in on your sensor wire. You should have 0 volts, less than 10 ohms, less than 15 ohms on your signal return, which is your ground, and the PCM. And then your signal wire plugged in, back probe 0.7. If you unplug the EGR connector, you sometimes, on some vehicles, on your signal would have 5 volts on it, depending on the design. I feel like on this one, it had 0 volts, but I'm going to have to go back and kind of look at that further. But I just know from experience, you know, this is as far as I need to take it. Unfortunately, the scan tool doesn't show the 0.7 volts raw data, which would be really helpful to truly confirm that it's not an open circuit on the signal wire. But generally, if that's the case, it would read 100%, and it's reading 0%, which is 0.7 volts. But yeah, there's a small chance it could be an open circuit on the signal wire. So you need to be mindful of that. And you can also check continuity with the disconnected key off and compare that resistance to another like vehicle, you know, with the same wiring PCM and preferably the same year, and see if that resistance is the same on the signal wire disconnected with your black lead going to ground. And you're looking for basically transistor resistance to tell you, yeah, it's all connected in the wiring and no, there's no open. So anyways, sorry it's such a long video, but I just wanted to explain this to you. And there we go. So the PCM on this one is what fixed it. EGR valve was shorted, damaged the PCM internally. So PCM and EGR valve is what we did. Thank you.